So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in this world. Yes, we're an hour, we moved back an hour, or you could say we were an hour late. And yes, it was due to coordinating with the Medicare project. We were having a meeting, and some of our staff thought we could get me from that meeting into a studio, a local studio, in time to have plenty of time for this presentation. Didn't quite make it. There were some glitches, last minute glitches with the studio, which again, thank you so much for your patience. Today we're going to talk about the Prevention Myths book, cardiovascular inflammation. We've talked about that over the past couple of weeks, but we really never talked about the fact that you can actually measure cardiovascular inflammation. And to put this in context, as most of you know, most doctors look at LDL, cholesterol. Why do they look at cholesterol and don't know anything about cardiovascular inflammation? And why do they look at cholesterol? Because the plaques that we see in arteries, which clearly cause this problem, are made up mostly of cholesterol. But what is missing in most doctors' perspective and knowledge is that cholesterol, no matter what level it is not quite so much of an issue unless you're burning the lining of your artery wall. Now, that's what we're going to be talking about today. You know, we've had so many major myths and errors in terms of medicine and prevention. For the longest time, we thought, well, if it's cholesterol, and specific to this, we thought, well, if it's cholesterol in the plaque, then it must be from cholesterol in your diet. You are what you eat, right? That there are very few people these days that are worried about cholesterol in the diet. And those few are even more informed than the majority of us. Unfortunately, the majority still thinks that it's the cholesterol level in the blood. That does have some importance. That is an issue, but not nearly what most of us think. So again, we'll cover that today, how to actually measure cardiovascular inflammation in the bloodstream and how we do it. We've talked about basics of cardiovascular inflammation. What is it? Cardiorespiratory fitness. We've talked about plenty of items in this space. But here's the key stuff that we talk about on this channel that makes a contribution. Like cardiovascular inflammation, there are many things in heart attack and stroke prevention that are just not well understood by the majority of the medical community. For example, the science is clear. The evidence is clear. Your typical primary care doctor does not understand prediabetes, insulin resistance. They don't even know how to diagnose it, let alone manage it. Now, we obviously, the people that do know that, there's not enough of us to go around to take care of everybody, to treat everybody. We do, for example, my version of retirement is to continue to see patients and to start up this series of clinics for the Medicare program. But there's still not enough of us. So that's what this channel is all about. It's about helping people understand the things that are really most likely to cause the things that kill and disable us. We know what kills and disables us. We know that it's heart attack. We know that it's stroke. Top 2 and 1 in 3 causes of death and disability. We also know that there's a lot of similarities between that and other disablers, like the number 1 cause of blindness, the number 1 cause of kidney disease. They all have to do with insulin resistance. But it's that once you get to that next step, what causes that? The prediabetes, diabetes. Doctors don't quite understand that well. So our goal is to help people understand that. Within just a few hours and a very small investment, you can learn more than your typical doc about this areas. This slide is showing how you can do that with our webinar series. We also have some courses. That's the least expensive way to do that. We've given a lot of those away for free. You keep your eye open, you can get some of these for free. And within just a couple of hours, again, you can know more about how to predict and prevent your own heart attack, stroke, death, and disability than most docs. So I'm going to skip on over to comment about the book. Again, one of the things we're doing in this series is covering content in the book itself. It's out there. It's on Amazon. That's the easiest way to get it. And it's not that expensive. You can get it as a digital book. And again, it covers a huge portion of this content. It doesn't go that deep into insulin resistance, but it does go deep into what we're going to be talking about today, cardiovascular inflammation. And one of the things that it does is focus on some of the myths. The myth, for example, that, hey, you know what? My uncle had a heart attack and I've got a lot of his genes. Could we just do a stress test to see if I'm going to get a heart attack? Well, you can do a stress test, but it's probably not going to tell you whether you're going to have a heart attack. There are other things that are much better, like what we'll be talking about today. So, did you know you can actually measure inflammation? We'll be talking about that and talking a little bit more deeply on how to do it. Now, as you will see in here, a lot of people get concerned about excess LDL particles settling in the artery walls. They assume that it's because of the amount of LDL in the blood. No, it's not. It's because of this lining, the intima layer of the blood, the artery. Once you get inflammation in that area, you damage that intima layer. LDL passes through it. It won't pass through the next layer, the media layer. It gets stuck between those two. That's why we can measure something called the IMT space, the intima media space, and see how much plaque is in there. Then what happens is the body's immune system recognizes this as a foreign body or a pathogen, that the term the docs often use. Patho meaning badness and gen creates. So a pathogen, something that creates disease. When the immune system recognizes that, they say, you know what, that may not be a foreign body, but it's foreign to where it should be in the body, so we're going to go in and attack it. Well, that's where this whole inflammatory spiral begins. It starts with macrophages. We'll talk about those. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the other immune cells. But macrophages recognize that. They go in. They begin to get engorged, eating up this LDL. And then they start to activate. They start to release cytokines. They start to release things that attract. Cyto meaning cell, kines meaning attractant. So they attract more inflammatory cells, and that's why it's a spiral, not just a circle. The plaque develops, and this arterial process of inflammation can go on for years. If it does, then you can get a rupture. That intima layer is very thin. Most sources say it's really only one cell layer thick. So if you've got hot plaque, inflammatory process, liquid going on here, when you get a crack in that intima layer, you get spillage out into the flowing bloodstream. When those cytokines, that inflammatory process touches the bloodstream, it forms a clot. And that's when the issue happens. If the clot's big enough and it goes to the heart, it's a heart attack. If it's big enough and it goes to the brain, it's a stroke. Over time, inflammatory chemicals weaken this fibrous cap, this intima layer, and that's where you start to get into danger of forming the rupture, which leads to the clot, which leads to the event. Doctors used to think that clogged arteries were just caused by the passive buildup of bad cholesterol because they saw the cholesterol in the plaque and they assumed it's like hair clogging up a drain. Nope, that's not the way it happens. Here's another image version drawing diagram of cardiovascular inflammation, and plaque, showing a healthy artery on the left. This red layer is the intima. This pink layer is the thick muscular media layer. And here's what happens. You start getting that buildup of that yellow LDL. But as you see, as you start getting that buildup, you start getting these green things. Well, green is because myeloperoxidase, one of the inflammatory enzymes, is green. It's like hemoglobin is red. Myeloperoxidase is a very similar type of protein, and it shows up green. Again, pardon the gross image, but when kids get a cold, you can see a green tint to the mucus. That's that same myeloperoxidase that we can test for in the blood. So as you see up at the top here, you start getting oxidized LDL, oxidized cholesterol. You start getting inflammatory markers with C-reactive protein, then myeloperoxidase, then plaque 2, troponin T. We measure some of these in terms of our own inflammatory biomarkers. And that's what we watch on a regular basis, quarterly, for most of our patients. There is no single definitive test for cardiovascular inflammation. There are, however, panels, combinations of tests that help us measure the process. Oxidized LDL is a helpful piece of information. We look at a panel including C-reactive protein, microalbumin creatinine ratio, LPPLA2 or Plaque 2, and MPO, as I mentioned earlier. There are a couple of others that we tend to not look at, IL-6 being one of them. I'm going to skip over FH. That's a different issue. Most of you watching this channel are at that level of sophistication to understand that that's something for a different topic. But let's go back and talk about oxidized LDL, OXLDL. You can test for that, and we do in some of our patients when we can get it. It's not that easy to obtain it, but when we can get it and it fits for that patient, we will look at it. Oxidized LDL is much more likely to pass through the injured intima lining, those injured intima cells. And again, it's not holes. We used to think it was holes in that lining. It's passing through the cell itself. It's called transcytosis, trans meaning across, and cyto again meaning cell. We can test for oxidized LDL. This test measures the concentration of oxidized LDL per unit of blood. The higher the concentration, the more likely one is to have cardiovascular disease. The human ability to transport and use oxygen gives us extra power. In return, this oxygen metabolism, it does exact a toll of increased oxidation. So it's this oxidation, this thing that we worry about. You remember some of the most popular vitamins, A, C, and E, are antioxidants. Multi-billion-dollar supplement industry. It's all about this concept, this issue that we use oxygen, so therefore we're able to get 6 times the energy that a yeast or fungus gets out of a protein or a fat or a sugar molecule. But with that increased energy that we're able to get using oxygen, we also have the problem of oxidation, which is the major form of inflammation. Oxidation, inflammation, same thing in terms of the human process. Now, how do we measure that? C-reactive protein is one of the things we look at. C-reactive protein is a protein made by the liver in response to multiple inflammatory challenges. You can get a significant number of false positives. For example, if I give 100 people a flu vaccine today, within 48 hours, 2/3 of those people, 66 of them, will have a positive C-reactive protein. Now that is not, cardiovascular inflammation. That's not the kind that's going to cause ongoing increasing risk for heart attack and stroke. So again, that would be what I would label a false positive. But it does happen with increased inflammation in the walls of the artery. So it's something that we look for. We want to get these different sources that we'll talk about during the presentation today and put together a picture of, okay, do you have inflammation? And if so, just how much? As I've said, there's too many false positives. We can't rely on CRP alone. So we use the other tests as well. Microalbumin creatinine ratio. That's really one of the most important tests. It measures the amount of albumin or protein in the urine. Now, our bodies make a lot of albumin. In fact, it's by far the most common protein in our body. We're not going to lose so much albumin that we're worried about losing albumin. The reason we're interested in microalbumin creatinine ratio is we understand how much we're leaking protein. Why do we worry about that? It's a thing called the glomerulus. A glomerulus, again, is another big word. All it is a filter. In fact, each of your kidneys has about 1 million filters. Now, why are we worried about that filter? Well, let's go back and connect another dot. Most filters have a structure that supports a membrane, right? And then the fluid passes through the membrane. That's exactly what happens with the glomerulus or the million filters in each of our kidneys. There's a structure that supports it, and then there's a membrane. That membrane happens to be the intima, the membrane that lines the artery wall, the membrane that we were talking about just a minute ago that can get damaged during an inflammatory process. So here's what we're looking at. If we can measure the amount of damage to that membrane by looking at microscopic amounts of protein loss through the kidney, then we can start getting an estimate of how much damage you have to the intima layer of your arteries. So if we know that that's going on, then we know that if that intima is leaking protein, it's likely leaking LDL. If it's leaking LDL, then everywhere you have an artery, you've got an intima that's leaking LDL, or the quote bad, what most people call bad cholesterol, through that lining and getting stuck into the artery wall. So as you see, that's a very direct indicator of the root cause process itself. Now, there are two others that we look at: Plaque 2, LPPLA2, and MPO, myeloperoxidase. Both of them are very similar in that they're actual actors in this play. They are the enzymes that cause inflammation. Let's get a little bit deeper. So monocytes, that's one of these types of inflammatory cells. And you'll see that the monocytes do transition into macrophages and then foam cells. Monocytes slip through the intima, the endothelium, and go into that intima media space. When they come in contact with oxidized LDL as plaque, they become activated. When they become activated, they transition into slightly different and more active cells called macrophages. The macrophages continue to grow. They start looking for more oxidized LDL to destroy, consume, to liquefy and digest. These cells then join other activated macrophages and form foam cells. And you start getting fatty streaks when you've got a lot of foam cells activated within your artery wall. As this process continues, these cells release enzymes, Plaque 2. We can actually measure that enzyme. That enzyme destroys, liquefies, and digests this LDL. These enzymes only appear when the cellular destructive process is active. The higher the concentration of LPPLA2, the higher the likelihood that the patient or you are fighting an active atherosclerotic cardiovascular inflammatory process. Myeloperoxidase, it's another enzyme, very similar. How is it different? Simply that it comes from another type of immune cell. You remember we have multiple types of immune cells. The Plaque 2 comes from monocytes and macrophages, foam cells. Myeloperoxidase comes from a thing called neutrophils. There are other names for it as well. Leukocytes, neutrophils. These neutrophils are specific to the inflammatory process within the arterial wall. So they are more specific to cardiovascular disease than some of the other tests of inflammation. Both Plaque 2 and MPO can be detected in the blood and allow measurement of the inflammatory process within the artery wall. IL-6, interleukin 6, we talk about that several times in the book. Interleukin 6 is the interleukins are proteins which are produced by various cells within the body. Interleukins function as pro-inflammatory cytokines, meaning they cause inflammation and attract other inflammatory cells. It's usually elevated with cardiovascular disease, but also with other infections, autoimmune disorders. So again, there is no single individual good test. You know, there's an axiom or a common story in med school. If you don't have a single test for something, it's because there's not a good single test. And this is one of those areas where we have to look at a panel. Thank you so much for your interest. We're going to go into a Q&A session as soon as Gilbert gives us the water ball. So, despite the fact that we had to move it, and again, thank you so much for your patience with us. We have a strong public health focus, and the Medicare program that we're developing is one of our biggest chances to directly impact the health of a large slice of the American public in the South, where I was born. So we will continue to do that, and we'll continue to develop balance between that and our program here. So SAE Taxman said, I recently found out I have B negative blood. After some reading, I see that there's a high incidence of inflammation and heart disease. Is this true, and what should I do differently? SAE Taxman, you know, there may be some. I'll never say absolutely never, or I'll rarely say absolutely never on stuff. But I'm not familiar with any significant risk associated with blood type. You know, you hear about blood type diets, you hear about a lot of stuff associated with blood type. And the reality is there's a lot, you know, it's like they tend to say, a lot more heat than light on that subject, a lot more attention, a lot more focus than there is hard evidence. So, Bambi Grage, new time. Thank you again for your patience, Bambi, and the rest of you that have tuned in. As I said, we will continue to develop balance between our programs. Bart Robinson, thanks for attending. Good morning. I like the new time. We may end up, Bart, going to a new time, and it may be this later time. Can't guarantee yet. We're still trying to juggle and balance things. Thanks for attending. John Tocho, interesting intro music. Yeah, you know, interesting usually is an interesting adjective. Don't expect everybody to like it. No matter what intro music we would have, there's going to be some folks that consider it interesting. I think it's sort of, when I listen to it, it's sort of like, it sounds like it's getting ready to get started, but then backs up and goes really slowly. So I don't know if the guys picked that out because it reminded them of me or what's going on, but it is what it is. You know, Joe Riley asked at one point, could we have a 1-minute intro to give people time to dial in? Because once we actually go live, whether you've scheduled something or not, once you actually go live, YouTube and Facebook and some of the other places will send out a notice to folks that, yep, they're getting up and going. So that's what we're doing. And that was the music. For those of you that enjoy it, I'm glad you did. For those who didn't, you're not alone. S55B, good morning. Good morning to you as well. Riz, good morning, Doc. Good morning, Riz. And we got John Tocho. Remember to hit the thumbs up. Thank you so much, John. You're very good at reminding us about that. And why does the thumbs up make a difference? Because there's a machine in there that's watching what all of us do, especially you as the viewer. And when you hit a thumbs up, and especially when you put this in your social media feeds, and they start getting people coming back from Facebook or Twitter or other social media, and they've been referred by folks like you who are watching it, they realize that, you know what, there are human beings out there that are watching this, they like it, they're referring others to it. There's something important here. Thank you so much, John, for that reminder, because I always forget it. Amal Sal, Godendavand. You know, I'm sorry, Amal, but I don't recognize that flag or that language. You're going to have to, if you don't mind, let us know where you're dialing in from. I'd appreciate it. Sophia M., good morning. Good morning to you, Sophia. Can fasting help reduce inflammation? At this point, it's a great question, Sophia. Thank you for asking. It gives me an opportunity to head down that little bunny trail for a little bit. At this point, nobody should be doubting the value of fasting. There was, I think it was, again, 2019, December 26, New England Journal, literature review, science review, evidence review about just plain old intermittent fasting. And for most of us, that ends up just translating out to something very simple and easy like skipping breakfast. Significant amounts of information indicating that slows down inflammation. It slows down the inflammatory process. It creates something that we call autophagy. Auto meaning self, phage meaning to eat. Now, what is eating oneself? It's our cells. It is our body's method for doing recycling. That's if you go through the rest of that process on the inflammation, that's what the body's trying to do with inflammation. It's trying to recycle that oxidized LDL. But unfortunately, it gets a little bit out of control. And just like soldiers in a battle that are out of control, you can start taking friendly fire. That's what cardiovascular inflammation is all about. Our body's taking friendly fire from our own allies, our own immune system. Now, autophagy slows that down dramatically. And yes, intermittent fasting clearly increases that. Prolonged fasting increases that. Time-restricted eating, which is a generic term for intermittent fasting. All those things improve cardiovascular inflammation. Thank you so much for bringing it up, Sophia. Fort Worth West Side, Ansel Keys was proof that one determined bully type personality can send a medical paradigm careening off the rails, causing hundreds of thousands of people to develop inflammation by diet. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for putting that out there. I did a series. There's a fellow named Chris, I can't remember his last name, reported on his work. He was like a forensic epidemiologist, if you can believe that. Forensic epidemiologist looking at bad things that happened in epidemiology for the National Institutes of Health. One of the things he did was cover this whole Ansel Keys thing. And it was very interesting. He actually found in the basement of I think it was a young physician whose father was a partner of Ansel Keys. They had done some work. And here's what happened. They found out the exact opposite of what Ansel Keys and had expected, that people with fat in their diet, cholesterol in their diet, were actually having some decrease in heart attack and stroke rates. That didn't fit their paradigm. So guess what? That day they ended up in the basement of that family. That family, one of the family members was a physician, wanted to get that information out. And since then, it has come out. I wish I could tell you which video that was in, but that was a couple of years ago, and I just don't remember the title. But if you read things like The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It by Senior Moment. What's the guy's name? Taubes. Is it Richard Taubes? No. Somebody remind me. Do a fact check for me. Those books, that whole series of articles and literature helps understand how, yes, Fort Worth West Side is exactly right. A strong personality like an Ansel Keys can obstruct science in a big, big way. I can't help but say this, but I had one of those moments recently, this week. And it has to do with if you're an anti-vaxxer, just close your ears. I began to look at information from a fellow named Joe Mercola. And I had seen some of his stuff before. I was impressed by a lot of the science, but then I started looking at what he was saying about the vaccine, and I got very, very upset because a lot of people are not taking vaccines based on information in social media these days. And yes, I'm sure that some folks hearing this will be anti-vaxxers as well. And I'm okay. Vaccines have caused damage as well. But it's sort of like saying, I'm never going to get in an airplane because people have, a lot more people have had very negative impacts on their lives from the virus than have had from the vaccine. And that's just the truth. If you've heard the news recently about Biden accusing Facebook of talking about killing people, well, you know, some of that boils down to, here's my understanding of what I'm hearing, that there are like 18.2 million Facebook entries that I think they're going to take down. And 2/3 of those came from a dozen people. Number one on that list was Joe Mercola. So for those of you who love Joe Mercola, I'm sorry, I don't. I think some of his misinformation about the vaccine has resulted in a lot of unnecessary deaths. Fort Worth West Side. What do you consider acceptable ranges for MPO, LP, PLA2? It really depends on the tests. Not only the lab that's doing it. We do most of ours through Quest and LabCorp, but also the actual specific test kit that they happen to be using at the time. For most of these, it's in the range of 400 for MPO and 120 to 140 for Plaque 2. Again, you need to look at the specific test and the specific, reference ranges they should give you in the report. James Cantor, endocrinologist, did not want to do a fasting insulin since I am already diabetic. Well, I don't know the situation, James. To me, I get fasting insulin on a regular basis on my patients because that tells us a lot, whether they're diabetic or not. We want to know what's going on. That's sort of like saying, well, I'm not going to look at the speedometer because I know how fast I'm going. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes you're not. Fernando, does pain increase inflammation in the body? Yes. Number one, 2 or 3 points here. It's a great question, Fernando, and part of it I've never really thought about. One thing you do need to know is you don't feel pain from the inflammation. you don't feel yourself developing plaque. You don't feel yourself developing inflammation. That just does not happen. On the other side, does pain actually increase inflammation? Here's the thing. If you're living with enough pain to where you're living with cortisol on a regular basis, cortisol release or epinephrine release, cortisol, these two things can raise your blood sugar on a regular basis and can cause what we would call increased insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the number one cause for cardiovascular inflammation. So yes, if your pain is causing you to have increased cortisol, it can cause inflammation. But again, it's going to cause it through other mechanisms that we talked about. We've got a lot of comments. Let me see if I can move a little bit more. I did purchase the Prevention Myths book. Looks good. Thank you so much, James. I appreciate that. Now, the first two chapters are readable. The chapters beyond are a little bit more like an encyclopedia. So you may not want to try to bite off all of that at once. Medimedia. This talk and subject is beyond brilliant. Well, thank you so much. That's a very nice thing to say. I appreciate that. Please discuss why IL-6 could be so high when everything else was so high, but homocysteine also high. Well, homocysteine, the classic time that you're going to see homocysteine elevated is what we call a poor methylator. You may have heard about that when you were reading about supplements. MTHFR, methylene hydrofolate reductase. Again, major big science words, but and even the term poor methylator is a little bit too technical for a lot of folks. Here's the bottom line. You go back to that antioxidation process that we talked about today in the inflammation discussion. Oxidation causes inflammation. Well, the mitochondria are our furnaces of the cell. They create energy. Any furnace that works I'm 64. Some of those have been working for 64 years. You're going to expect to see some burning embers lying around, maybe some burnt holes in some of those mitochondria. You want to clean those out, and you want to deal with the oxidation that's driving that. Well, here's the thing. Our body deals with oxidation, in a chemistry lab, high school chemistry lab. How do you deal with inflammation? Or how do you deal with oxidation or addition of an oxygen molecule, burning? You douse it out, you add water, or you add a hydrogen atom, depending on which level of the lab you're in. In our biological systems, it's not so much that we're adding a hydrogen atom to slow down that oxidation. We add an entire methyl group. That's why you hear all these things on the internet about a poor methylator. Because you see, it turns out, genetically, many of us don't methylate very well. And if we don't methylate very well, we have problems associated with oxidation and therefore inflammation. And guess what? You tend to get elevated homocysteine. Now, what do you do about all that? That sounds very theoretical. Well, you can go to the human genetics lab, and I used to work for one, and I had my own testing. I don't think I would have paid for that had I had to pay for it, because the practical upshot of all of this is a little bit different, a little bit easier, a little bit less expensive. You just get methylated B complex vitamins. They're available on the internet. You go to Thorne, THORNE, MethylGuard. And I mentioned a brand name. I get no compensation from Thorne. I do know that they have a good methylated complex. We also have a methylated complex that we do get compensation from. It's called Restore Me. Just make sure you get a methylated B complex if you have elevated homocysteine. Medium Media. Wouldn't homocysteine be an inflammatory marker also? Yes, in the way that we just discussed, Medi. Thank you for bringing that up. That was a great topic to head down for a while. Chuck Weinberg, at what age should you be tested for inflammation? Well, here's the thing, Chuck. We get the vast majority of our patients are folks that are in their 60s. Many of them have already had a heart attack or stroke or a positive calcium score. One of the most common reasons for coming to see us is a positive calcium score. The bottom line is that's too late. You need to know, even in your 20s, if you have insulin resistance, because that's what drives this process in most of us. There are more and more teenagers and even younger getting full-blown diabetes. And for every one of those that gets full-blown diabetes, you've got hundreds, maybe thousands of kids developing inflammation. Most of them are going to get over it because their body's young and they've got a lot of capacity, but developing it most commonly from insulin resistance, most commonly from too much body fat, most commonly from our dietary and lifestyle habits. You can supplement. We talked about a couple of supplements already. You can do laboratory tests. You can provide prescriptions to people, and you can do surgery, stents. You can out stent. You can't out bypass. You can't out prescribe, and you can't out supplement a lifestyle problem. Those things are to be used as a help when somebody needs it, assuming they're working on their lifestyle. I don't know if it's Millard or Millard. You need to let me know how to pronounce that, Mr. Woods, Miss Woods, Mr. Woods. Is it fair to say that a different, and I know you comment frequently, so I appreciate it. I'd like to pronounce the name correctly. Is it fair to say that a different medical problem or injury than arterial disease might cause inflammation markers to be higher than normal? Absolutely. As I said, we know 2/3 of us will have an elevated C-reactive protein just from taking a flu shot. So some inflammation to a certain level, certain extent is good. It's the body, it's the soldiers in our body taking care of business. But the problem is ongoing subclinical recurring inflammation in our artery walls is a very bad thing. And we want to keep an eye on that. That's why we look at what we're looking at. But it's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. James Cantor, being that I do have type 2 diabetes, what is an acceptable microalbumin creatinine ratio? I've got plenty of type 2 diabetics that have too low to count. Now, and so it's like, really? Full-blown diabetic? So here's one of the things that you tend to see on our channel. It's folks that are watching this channel, a lot of them are very, very smart. A lot of them got interested. And yes, I've had plenty of 20-something-year-olds come in and want to get tested. We've found some significant prediabetes in some. I've found full-blown diabetes in some 30 and 40-year-olds. I also have found it in some 50, 60, and 70-year-olds who were just getting started in that process, did not have significant intima damage yet, and their microalbumin creatinine ratio was negligible. That's what mine tends to be. Again, I knew what to look for, and I was looking for it. So now, the next question on a practical basis for somebody who's had it for a while and didn't know it, wasn't able to get the prevention process started early enough, how is there any reversal to it? The answer is yes. You can actually reverse microalbuminuria, spilling that albumin into the urine. Now that takes time. And sometimes that's not a practical goal because you get larger damage to arteries within that filter system. But it does. You can get improvement. So for men, the number that we want to look for is 3 to 4 or less. For women, 7 to 8 or less. And you'll see it on the labs themselves. On the labs, they look at 30. So 30 is something that's where somebody has they've progressed all the way to full-blown kidney failure, levels of damage there. And the whole goal, as you say, James, is to decrease, reverse, and stabilize that. Daniona, what do you think of EECP therapy? Danny, I'm not familiar with EECP. If you want to not sure what that is. If you want to give me a little bit more detail, I might have heard of it, might not have. Swan Moon, do you suggest regular tests for someone who has a factor V lead-in? If so, how often and which tests? So yes, Swan, it's interesting that factor V lead-in video that I did a couple of years ago resurfaced again recently, and I saw a lot of people reacting to it. Factor V lead-in it's a mutation in the factor V component of the blood clotting system. It causes an increased clotting risk. So I've got several patients that have it. One of them was a patient that was in a car wreck. It was discovered when he started forming clots quicker after the broken bones from the car wreck. And that's unfortunately how most factor V lead-in gets discovered. From looking at populations and genetic studies, it appears that this mutation first occurred back in Italy, the mid-1700s, 1800s. Once you start getting that far back, there's a significant amount of unknown there. So I didn't really answer your question, Swan. I really talked to those folks, unlike yourself, who are unaware of factor V lead-in. Here's the issue. Factor V lead-in is an increased risk for clotting, and you're right. So what we're looking for, cardiovascular inflammation, is an increased risk for clotting. So you start thinking about some of the things that we have looked at in the past or we look at now. Another thing that I would consider popular myth is the recent statement that, well, because of the Esprit trial, the Ascend trial, a couple of other trials, we really shouldn't be using baby aspirin anymore. I don't agree with that. And once you start talking with people that do this stuff all day, every day, you begin to get a different perspective. Yes, if you're an otherwise totally healthy 60-year-old with zero plaque, no inflammation, no insulin resistance, no other problems like a factor V lead-in, then yeah, some of those things don't make sense. But if you're a pre-diabetic with plaque, whether you're 50 or 70, I would reconsider that modern popular advice to not take baby aspirin. Now, what do you do? What to do with factor V lead-in? Again, Swan Moon, you know that there's different things to look at. But the question you brings up another very, very important point. Whether you're looking at FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, factor V lead-in, Lp(a), which caused Bob Harper's heart attack, cigarette smoking, all of these things are increased risk for heart attack and stroke. And here's the key thing to remember. There is no single individual risk for heart attack and stroke. There are some really big ones, really common ones. For those that have rheumatoid arthritis, that inflammatory process is a big risk for heart attack and stroke. For those of us who have insulin resistance and prediabetes and diabetes clear, huge risk. More of us get problems associated with insulin resistance or prediabetes than full-blown diabetes. But if you've got one risk factor, you need to look at all of those, monitor all of those, monitor the inflammation process. So I went down 3 or 4 bunny holes on that question, Swan Moon. It was a great question. Bottom line, yes, I would monitor all the things that are going on with potential risk because most of us don't have just one thing. And if you've got one known thing like factor V lead-in, How old are you? Have you had a Kraft insulin survey? Do you know exactly what not only your fasting insulin and glucose are, but your 1 hour and your 2 hour post-challenge? So we're tying together a few of the comments that we've heard already. Jonathan Hull, good morning, Dr. B. I read your book. You read the whole thing? And you made it through chapters 3 through the end? And you think it's excellent? I appreciate that. That's very, very nice. I appreciate it. Thanks for publishing it. Do you normally prescribe both a CIMT and FIMT for routine screening, or just CIMT? Help me out, FIMT. Maybe I'm having a senior moment. I do use CIMT as a screening basis, use it quite a lot. From a comparison perspective, most people think about several other things. As we've talked about in the whole purpose of the book, most people think, oh, let me go get a stress test. Stress test does not predict heart attack. It doesn't really show risk that well. What it does show is whether you've got 50% or more occlusion of the artery, and it also shows your cardiovascular conditioning. Both of those are important, but neither one of them shows whether or not you've got soft plaque. CIMT is the only thing that shows whether you've got soft plaque. Do I recommend angiogram on everybody, especially everybody with a positive stress test? No. Again, read the book. That's what the purpose for it is. And thank you so much for your comments, John, on that space. CT angiogram and calcium score are two of the more common ones that I would recommend. And I don't recommend calcium score, CT angiogram, and CIMT on everybody. I use CIMT by far the most. For some people, I'll recommend a CT angiogram, and some people a calcium score. One of the reasons that I'll use that CIMT by far the most is it's the only one that helps quantify just how much plaque do I have. This whole concept of arterial age, which you'll get through a CIMT, is a very, very helpful concept. But most of all, it's the only process that will really show us on a regular basis whether or not we have inflamed plaque, whether or not we've got that inflammation process going on and we have liquid plaque. So Marcia Susanna Baccaris, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Dr. Brewer, I read on the K2 supplement bottle that I need to talk to my doctor before using it because I'm on Eliquis. What are your thoughts on that? First, let me give the what's the word I'm looking for? The thing that they always say, this is not medical advice. I have been on Eliquis taking K2. There is very little evidence that K2 has anything at all to do with clotting. There's some muddy evidence, but the vast majority of it just doesn't appear to fit. So let me go back and connect those dots, though, Marcia, for everybody else. So when people have events like heart attack, stroke, put a stent in, the docs will often put them on anti-clotting agents. You know, we've been talking a lot about anti-clotting agents. Up until the past few years, by far the most common anti-clotting agents were Coumadin, things that we called a class of drugs called VKA, vitamin K antagonists. They did away with the impact of vitamin K. Vitamin K was known for, it was a what would we call a moiety? It's a portion of the molecules used to help in the clotting mechanism. So the vitamin K antagonists like Coumadin would actually decrease clotting. So that's where this confusion came in. Well, vitamin K can cause clotting because it's part of that mechanism. Vitamin K2 does not appear to have that same impact as vitamin K1. Very different. Now, again, this is not medical advice. I have used it. I have not seen anybody that I felt had any significant risk associated with that because it's not the vitamin K1. Let me just make one other point, Marcia. Eliquis has an impact that's not associated with it. It's not Eliquis, rivaroxaban or Xarelto, apixaban, these others, they're what's called new oral anticoagulants, NOACs, and they're not vitamin K antagonists anyway. It's just the old school stuff. So went several places like I often do once I start going down these bunny holes. Thanks for the topic. Danny one, awesome detailed information. Thank you so much, Danny. I appreciate that. Media, tongue twister. All my blood work was good, but IL-6 was so high. Could it be from my long daily workouts? That's a possibility. Again, you want to make sure when you say all, what does all in all my blood work mean? Did you actually have for example, a full-blown Kraft insulin survey? Because if you didn't, you're probably missing some very key stuff. Gianluigi, you've been here before. Thanks for coming back. Good morning, Doc, from Gianluigi, Milan, Italy. You know, it's very near Milan that factor V Leiden was discovered. Just got your book, started reading it. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it. Do you think, Millard, do you think that increased globulins in a blood panel has meaning for cardiovascular diseases? Not the routine globulins that you tend to look at, but it's not that simple. But on a routine blood panel, no. David Dodge, Gary Taubes. What was I saying? I was saying Richard. Why was that? You know, I get in front of the camera and my brain starts going in a whole bunch of different ways. I try to remember too much all at once. Thank you so much, though. It was Gary Taubes. He wrote a couple of great books. One was Good Calories, Fat Calories. I think that one was like the 700 or 800 page version of why we get fat and what to do about it. And I think that one was the shorter, more digestible. If you want really short, really digestible, he started all of that with an article in, was it New York Times Magazine? With the same name and same title. James Cantor, I do not think we need a 1-minute intro. I think we can go straight into video. I appreciate the thoughts. If folks want to start, if we start getting a lot of voting on it, I'm comfortable with dropping it. I actually, others, please let me know if you want us to drop. Let us know if you want us to drop that 1-minute intro. Carrie, we are smart. If that's the Carrie I know, yes, you are. Very smart. Never a vac in life. FK that. I'm not sure what that meant. I don't think I can go. Why strokes, etc., then no previous ones did that explain? Bart, is it Chris Masterjohn? Chris Masterjohn talks a lot about that, about methylation. There's another guy too who's like that's about all he talks about, and he's got dark hair. He's also younger. I don't think he's quite as young as Chris. Swan Moon, Carrie, I agree. Millard Woods, save it, anti-vaxxers. You won't convince anyone else. You know, I also saw a headline today that the Republican Party, who's been involved with this, is really starting to come out and push and say, please start reconsidering vaccine. Carrie, Dr. McCullough is truth and genius. People do research, looking glass, blah, blah. Can't stay. Why did they call them anti-vaxxers when they get their flu shots? Call my inflammation. I think I've been high for a long time, has been high. It very well may be. If you haven't had these tests, I would consider getting them. Your thoughts on, Danny Ona, your thoughts on enhanced external counterpulsation. Oh, I did, if I'm remembering that correctly, I did do that once, did a short video on it. It reminded me of the ultrasound, the shock wave lithotripsy that you get with trying to break up kidney stones. It also reminded me of a thing called mast trousers, military anti-shock trousers. Unless I'm mistaken, it was basically looking at doing some counterpulsation on the arteries to break up some of that plaque. The reality was, there was some good theory, like so many things. There appeared to be some good theory, but not quite so much evidence to back it up. ET himself, thank you very much, ET, for your comments. Your thoughts and hints. So we just gave those. Again, good. If it's what I'm remembering, it had some interesting rationale behind it. But like so many things, interesting rationale is one thing. Having recurring, reliable scientific evidence is something else. T-Bone, if you live in Tennessee and believe in medical science, move, especially if you have kids. So true. Actually, we did live in Tennessee. My family wanted to move. I liked it there because of the healthcare entrepreneurialism. Healthcare, as you might have guessed, I also feel very strongly healthcare is messed up in the United States, and government's doing some good things to improve it, believe it or not. Business is also doing some good things to improve it, also, believe it or not. At the end of the day, you start looking at the places where we can get improvement in healthcare. To me, I think there are three places: the government, business, and people with social media. And I'm working in all three of those areas because healthcare is messed up. Josefina Lopez, I have many questions, but we'll watch from the beginning because you might have answered some of them. Thank you so much, Josefina. I appreciate that. A lot of people will dial in late. They'll hear something. They'll say, wait a minute, exactly what did you say? Swan Moon, thanks. Thank you, Swan. ET himself, I've heard that a baby aspirin is useless and one needs at least 325 daily. ET, I'm glad you brought that up. You're going to hear that a baby aspirin is useless, like I said a few minutes ago, from most docs now. Please consider more deeply and consider what we talked about today. Here's the other thing to think. Well, if a little bit is good, a lot's got to be a lot better, right? Not so much with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, not so much with aspirin. Going up to that higher level dose, 325, 360, the problem with that is you tend to get, you switch from one metabolic pathway to adding another metabolic pathway, the COX pathway, and start incorporating some inflammation type of components. So no, I would go back to a baby aspirin. Thank you. It's a great topic. Thanks for mentioning it. Swan Moon. Oh, thanks. I have arthritic feelings, so I'll check. Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts. Swan. No event 51. Not sure what that means. Jonathan Hull, femoral artery intermediate thickness. Oh, yeah. So, thank you, Jonathan. So, yes, we do. Didn't get what you were talking about. When you go back, Jonathan a few minutes ago asked if we used FEMT, femoral artery intermediate thickness. Now, here's where we use it. We don't use that very often. We don't use that on every screen. But you're bringing up a great point. About 1% of, usually plaque is not just a local item. Doctors generically and patients assume and tend to treat it as a local issue. In other words, I want to know if I've got plaque here in my heart. I don't, or I want to know if I've got it here to rule out strokes, with the implied assumption that it's not going on everywhere else. Plaque happens because of inflammation. And as you're pointing out here, you probably need to look at more than one area. Now, how true is that? When you start looking at, that's good logic, but we talked about this a minute ago. A lot of places have good logic, but the evidence is not that clear. So here's the question based on what Jonathan's bringing up. If you get a CIMT here in the neck and it's clear, what is the probability that you just happen to have, you looked at both areas, you didn't see any plaque, what's the probability that you actually had plaque somewhere else, you just didn't pick it up in either of these two areas? That's why some people just will go ahead and do a femoral screen as well. Here's the thing. If you have significant evidence that they have that there's plaque going on, and you don't see any in either of these, yes, it's worth doing it. What's the evidence? How often do you find it? It's less than 2%. Less than 2% have significant plaque, but you don't pick it up in either of these arteries. So we tend to not screen that, and especially if you go ahead and you pick it up, you know it's there. So great question. And yes, you obviously did read the book because you got pretty technical there. Wanda M, FIMT, femoral intimate median thickness test. Yes, thank you very much. BTC, Doc, what's your thoughts on CT heart flow? I don't know if you're talking about a heart flow. That term I'm not familiar with. I am clearly familiar with CTA, CT angiogram. It's a new technology. It's available. We talk about it a lot in the book. And the thing that's really good about that is the thing that's good about either calcium score or CIMT. It helps you see, okay, I've got plaque. It's very, very different to hear some doctors say, oh, you need to push away from the cereal and the orange juice. And maybe you need to lose a little bit of weight. It's very different from hearing that generic, vague statement and seeing the plaque in your arteries. That's what a calcium score will do. That's what a CIMT will do. And that's what a CT angiogram will do. Again, you ask about heart flow. I'm assuming that may be a private label version of that. BTC is a diagnostic tool. So again, that's my response. Oh, good question about the workouts. Haven't seen that yet. Don't need the intro, but whatever works for the channel. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it. T-bone. So again, what John's talking about is, some people are saying, hey, Doc, just ditch that 1 minute intro. We don't really need it. If you feel that way, please let us know. We'll respond. So we've got 2 votes to ditch the intro. That may mean we get to ditch some of that music that some of us find is interesting. T-Bone, if you drop the intro, people not subscribed to YouTube Premium miss the beginning of the show because they're forced to watch ads. See, John and Bart, that's what we run into, and that's what started some of this in the first place. It's the actual technology, the mechanism on how people get invited and pulled into the show. Chucky, thought of ivermectin use for COVID prevention and treatment. Thoughts? I've done several videos on it. It has, when I did those videos, I was saying, look, guys, I'll provide it. I provide it to some of my patients. It was amazing. I got very few people call me up and say, yeah, I'd like to have some ivermectin, Doc. There have been further studies since then. And yes, ivermectin is panning out in the further studies that it does appear to help. Comparison to, I'm sorry for the folks that are worried about the vaccine out there. I can't help but say it, but comparison of ivermectin to the vaccine, there is none. It's so Bruno Beirant, I need to get ready for another blood test. Well, please do, Bruno, and keep watching, keep concerned, and keep focusing on what you can do for your health. What are the top inflammation tests I need to order? Well, we just went through that. If you go back and watch the review on the video today, you'll see them. Microalbumin creatinine ratio, HS-CRP, C-reactive protein, MPO, myeloperoxidase, and LPPLA2, what we call Plaque 2. I use Discount Labs, which sends me to Quest. Yeah, Quest has those. Quest bought a company called Cleveland Health Labs, CHL, and that's where they got that capacity. Bruno, what are the top? Okay, I think we already did that. Bart, I'm just fine with the 1 minute intros. Thank you, Bart. ET himself, such a thing as too much quality B12 and blood test. No, you're not going to get too much of a problem. You get some overdose and danger of overdose with vitamin D3. You can get too much niacin. You're not likely to get too much B12. It's safe. HIIT training for 14 months. LDL went for, well, HIIT training is very important. Actually, we've just gotten three super chat buttons. Let me see if I can find those. This one is T-Bone. Joe R. Can't afford YouTube Premium. Thank you so much, T-Bone. I appreciate that. Swan Moon, $9.99 super sticker. Thank you so much, Swan. We really appreciate that. And we hope that the content that we're providing to you is worth that to you. Here's what happens. As you can see, there's a fellow on that's co-hosting with me right now. He's located in the Philippines. We're offshoring some of this work. His name is Gilbert. 9, 10, 20 bucks, $5 may not sound like a whole lot in the American economy, but in the Filipino economy, it's a big deal. We also have some doctors in Mexico that are working with us on developing content in this channel, and some genetic medical scientists. So this goes to help defray those costs and help get that content out to folks, so you can, for free, start learning about what your doc doesn't know on heart attack and stroke prevention. So thank you again, T-Bone and Swan Moon, and Tired Looking for name. And I asked, for those of you who haven't been on before, Tired Looking for Names commented a few times, and I asked how that came up. As you might guess, they were trying to develop their name, and every time they entered a name they wanted, somebody already had it. So they got tired looking for name. Thank you so much for the team. Thanks again. Bruno, also, where in Chicago can I get a good CIMT? Can they check thyroid nodule at the same time? So there's a good place in Nashville that gets CIMT. There's a good place in LA that gets a CIMT, and a place in Atlanta. I'm not familiar with a place in Chicago, but here's what I am familiar with. Todd Eldridge, the co-author of the book with me. He's also the owner of a company that does the best quality IMT that I have seen. IMT has its problems. It's, there's a major problem with garbage in, garbage out. And Todd's specialty has been he's accomplished two things with cardio risk. And if you want to know how to find cardio risk, we can get you that information. Michelle can get you that information. Our channel number is 859-721-1414. That's 859-721-1414. Thank you, Gilbert. That's what I'm saying. Gilbert is smart. He listens for a whole hour. He listens to the science that I'm spewing out, and that's the number that our folks can help you find a good one. Now, the other thing that's good about Cardio Risk is they actually do a milk run. They have a milk run through Florida. They have a milk run through New York. And what do I mean by milk run? It's like the old journeyman. Milk run is a technical term coming from my days at Toyota. It's where somebody goes around and delivers. Well, what Todd's people do is they have these milk run routes. He's got good, well-trained CIMTs, and they go around to Chicago, those areas. And so you can call this number. We'll give you Heidi's number, and Heidi can start getting you hooked up to the right place to get those. And no, Todd does not pay me for those, for that kind of plug. Frank Pereira, love the intro. Okay, so we've got 2 pros, 2 cons. Thanks for your input on it. So I think maybe T-Bone did 2 of these. I'm not sure. Okay, here we go. At ET himself, I had high B12 too. What does that mean? I don't worry about high B12. What I worry about is, high methylmalonic acid. Why would I worry about high methylmalonic acid? Somebody asked me that if we don't cover it today, somebody asked me that on the next video. Zavuya, do you take 200 milligrams of ivermectin every other day? Not anymore. I've had my vaccine and I'm not worried about it, but I did take it for a couple of months. I have a little swelling at the bottom of my right brain, right side on the brainstem. Very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. That's Swan Moon's super sticker and T-Bones. Ivermectin for the poor countries. There's a lot to be discussed about getting the vaccine to the poor countries as well. One can always go back to the beginning, even live, if one comes in late. Thanks, James. I didn't know that. Never thought about it, but you're right. ET himself, Swan Moon, nothing is mentioned. Zavuya, encephalopathy. And that's, for those of you who don't know, that's inflammation of the brain. Does ivermectin help with this? I've had a diet of sauerkraut, avocado chunks, no dairy, no mucus foods, and my brainstem seems to still be inflamed. It really depends on the cause, Zavuya. KU, cardio risk locations in Atlanta only put you on a list to be called when a test is available in the future. It does take a while. This is a test that I've known people that have waited for 3 months. During the COVID outbreak and the shutdown, they had to shut down for a lot of places. You see, they're dependent on doctors' offices in that area. So it's not like, so that's one of the major advantages, by the way, of a calcium score. Calcium score is not you don't have all of that garbage in, garbage out. It's very objective, but it only tells you calcium. And we've actually seen people who had a bunch of plaque, but it was soft and there was no calcium. They were at risk and didn't know it because it didn't show at all on their calcium score. Great comments. We do have a couple more. I thought we were done. ET himself, which B vitamins should be methylated? Take the B vitamin complex, all of them. There's like a half dozen of them. And again, if you look up the one I mentioned, Restore Me is what we use. It's got a little bit higher of methylfolate. Swan Moon, no intro to help balance it out. That's a great way to end up. Thank you so much, Swan. Thank you to the others. I appreciate your interest. See you next week.